What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 games that I would love to see get like a remaster or a remake. And this was on my mind because just recently I realized that Soul Reaver, or Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver to give it its proper name, and its sequel are actually getting a remaster due in December, which I plan on checking out, as I have pretty fond memories of playing Soul Reaver back in the day. And one of the things that has kept me from covering it on the channel up to this point is that oftentimes, older games like that don't run particularly well, which is really just one of many reasons that might contribute to something like a remaster or a remake being of value to anybody who actually wants to play and experience those games for themselves. So as we dive into this, a few things to keep in mind. Right away, I don't expect any of these to actually happen. This is basically just a fun little wish list. My hopes are high for absolutely none of these. But the other side of it is that, generally speaking, I'm on the more positive side of, remasters and remakes being generally a good thing. Because, as I mentioned, they offer people who might not have played these games a more accessible on-ramp to doing so, when they are done correctly. But I would be remiss not to mention that sometimes these approaches are honestly just thinly veiled cash grabs, like the very recent remaster for Horizon Zero Dawn that honestly looks a little worse to me, and was realistically just a very thin excuse for PlayStation to require a PlayStation Network account for the people who buy that on Steam. Now, luckily, I owned the original version from before they did that, so when I actually get around to reviewing that one, I'll be able to use the older version. But remasters in those cases change essentially nothing, while just trying to force you onto whatever platform it is thereafter. But with all of that said, let's go ahead and dive into this and talk about these. So first up, as always, we have Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, probably the number one on this list for games I would love to see get that kind of treatment, especially since for a very long time this was actually an impossibility, basically, as the IP was held by Activision for a long time, and they clearly weren't doing anything with it. However, with the recent buyout of them by Microsoft, technically Microsoft owns both the IP now and also the developers who had worked on it previously, so theoretically, if they wanted to revive this, it's well within the realm of possibility now. But given that they would be reviving a, I would say, somewhat obscure RPG from the 2000s, that while certainly a cult classic among CRPG nerds like myself, doesn't exactly have mass appeal. But this game's unique blend of magic meets, of course, Steamworks and industrialization really managed to hit a tone that just other games simply have not been able to. Though there are a couple games on the horizon that seem to be at least in line with this, which might make up for the fact that, this simply isn't ever going to happen, such as New Arc Line, or something a slight bit more different but seems to have the same tone via Clockwork Revolution. But what makes this game ripe for a remaster is that, like a lot of older titles from around that era, it doesn't really play nice on modern hardware. You have to do a few things to get it up and running, like an unofficial patch as an example. As without it, technically you can get the game running, but it is a very poor experience, which is deeply unfortunate as Arcanum is just such a great game that I'd love to see more people be able to experience it, which is why I have certainly been preaching that word over the past few years. Next up, though, we have Dragon Age Origins, a beloved classic that really isn't even all that old, to be honest. It's from 2009. Now, I'm very on the record about not exactly being as excited about Origins as the rest of the gaming community certainly seems to be at times, but one thing that I have consistently loved about Dragon Age over the years is the world building that they established in Origins. It really is just top-notch stuff. What is much less in quality, however, is the state that game is in, despite not even being that old. Which is to say, it runs very poorly on modern hardware. A lot of people will point you to this 4GB RAM patch or whatever that's supposed to help, but honestly, even that's pretty hit or miss, and you're likely to experience a bunch of crashing with or without it. And that's to say nothing of the game's, I would say, clunkier systems that were clunky when the game launched even, like the combat and the tactics system being a little awkward to use. So a remaster or a remake that sharpened up all of those clunkier systems while at the same time making it more friendly for modern hardware, I think would go a long way for this particular game, but again, I don't think we're going to see it. Third up, however, we have a bit of a CRPG deep cut with Lionheart, Legacy of the Crusader. The last game shoved out the door from Black Isle Studios before they closed down alongside Reflexive Entertainment. This is a game that was released quite literally half finished, and they did that because it was either release it or it never sees the light of day. Which is a real shame because the first 2 towns of this game have some incredible promise. They were really onto something, but then shortly after that the game devolves into a huge dungeon slog that it clearly wasn't set up for. So in terms of why I'd love to see this one remade or remastered would simply be to properly finish this game, as it really does have some great and interesting ideas. But at its core, it's an alternative history version of Europe, where during the Crusades, Europe was transformed by magic where spirits broke through, attached themselves to people, granting people both access to magic but also causing untold woe at the same time, leading to a very dark fantasy world where a relative peace has only been recently established and is already under threat from yet more dark forces, utilizing a system that is very similar to Fallout's special system. This game gives you a ton of options to roleplay and maneuver your way through at least the first couple of towns. And during those parts of the game, it is genuinely really good, and they were definitely on to something. But as I mentioned, the back half is quite literally not done, and if you leaned into building a character that is more about, say, charismatic skills like talking your way through problems and things like that, that's not really a viable character for the later half of the game, even though it has a lot of use in the early game. But really, it's just a shame that the legacy of this game is mostly just that it was unfinished, and I'd love to see it get the chance to actually shine for the clear vision they had for what this game was going to be that was just frankly never realized. Which brings us to entry number 4, Divine Divinity, the first game in the Divinity series, at least in terms of the order in which they were made. Chronologically, it's actually more in the middle. Divine Divinity tells the story of Lucian, who you may recognize from Divinity Original Sin 2 fame, but Divine Divinity is about, again, the rise to power for him before he was actually the divine. And it is a game that was truly ahead of its time, incorporating some, I would say, more action-oriented systems that see you questing and fighting monsters all through the land, while the wizard Zandalore attempts to gather the 7 races of Rivellon so you can become the divine, to put a stop to the Lord of Chaos. And this game both deals with really interesting concepts for the Divinity universe as a whole, but also it's just a really great game that was a surprisingly ambitious entry from Larian Studios that I think after this they honestly struggled to replicate for quite some time, as the follow-up, Beyond Divinity, is comparatively quite bad. But for as good as Divine Divinity is, it's another older title that just doesn't play nice with modern hardware. In fact, many of the times I've played it personally, I've had to use what is known as a hex editor in order to manually fix save files, because sometimes they can be corrupted or problems will just pop up, and while it's possible to play without those things happening, what you're likely not going to get around is the fact that things like the UI and menus and things aren't really designed with modern resolutions and stuff in mind, and thus a lot of it doesn't scale properly, and that's just one of many problems you might run into playing this thing. And Divine Divinity is such an incredible experience. I think it's a real shame that more people can't experience it without experiencing a potential host of different problems. Now, while it is my personal hope that Larian Studios is currently working on a follow-up to the Divinity series as a whole, as it has so much more to offer than just Original Sin 2 would have you believe, despite that being a great game, there is so much more to that universe. I do nonetheless kind of hope that Divine Divinity might get that treatment one day to make it more accessible for people who want to check out the series' origins, as it really is so much better than you might imagine. And then, last but not least, we have Jade Empire. The much neglected child of BioWare, Jade Empire was, I would say, a pretty unique RPG from 2007 that puts us in the role of a martial artist getting to the bottom of a mystery, all while you learn more and more different types of martial arts to use in the game's relatively interesting combat system that sees you potentially stringing together multiple martial art types, Combine that with some incredibly memorable story moments and characters all around, and you've got an all-around pretty fun title. But the reason I would love to see this one remastered is, once again, largely due to its age. This is another game that does not play particularly well with modern hardware, and in fact, if you buy the Steam version of it, you're likely not even going to be able to run it until you alter a few different files. It's not terribly difficult if you know what you're doing, and you have to do all that simply to get the game to run. And that's to say nothing of other problems you might have, like in particular when I played it, one cutscene would always crash the game unless I specifically changed the graphical settings down to their lowest possible point just to get through that single cutscene. And then of course, simply due to its age, it does have some jank involved with it, I would say. But more than anything, Jade Empire is just a unique bird as far as RPGs go. It does a lot of really interesting stuff that we really don't see a ton of, and I think it would be a shame to see a game like that more or less completely lost to the ages. And while I certainly don't expect to see like a sequel or any long-term support for this one, even just a couple of updates would be greatly appreciated. But I do think that is pretty much where we're going to wrap up this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to know what you think about any of these titles, or of course any other game you think might deserve a remaster or remake, or given, I would say, the ever-increasing number of these types of things we're seeing these days, perhaps even simply your favorite one that you've encountered thus far, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.